All right, welcome everyone. I ask you to take your seats. We're going to get started. Thank you all for coming. I know it's been a crazy last few days. I don't know about you if you've stayed up to watch all the events in Singapore, but we've been very busy and we have a lot to talk about. My name is Jenna Gibson. I'm the Director of Communications here at KEI, and I'll be the moderator today. We have a great panel of experts. In the interest of time, you have their names and their bios in front of you, so I won't go through it. But I hope you guys have a lot of great questions. We're going to talk for a little bit. I'll ask some of the panelists questions. They'll discuss amongst each other, and then we'll have time for some Q&A. So be sure to be thinking about your questions. And with that, I think we'll just kind of jump right into it. So my first question, just to get us started, is apparently, as of this morning, the nuclear threat is gone from North Korea, and we can all sleep easy. So I don't know if you guys have thoughts about whether you think the North Korean threat is truly gone at this point, or where do we need to be to get there? So I'll maybe start going this way. Soojin, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think the nuclear threat is gone, and we can sleep well as we'd like to. But what I think has happened after the summit, the U.S. North Korea summit, is that the beginning of a new chapter, a new history has been made. Because up until now, we've only been focusing on denuclearization, which rightly is our goal to achieve denuclearization. But so far, it has all failed over the past quarter of a century. And I think we need to look at what may have been done wrong so that we couldn't achieve what we wanted. Although it is crucial for us to focus on the denuclearization, I think it's also very crucial to look at the core of the problem. And that happens to be the deep distrust between the two hostilities, what they consider hostile countries. So I think the fact that the two leaders of these countries over the past 7 decades have been at odds and hostile to each other, and even just 6 months ago were throwing all insults at each other. The fact that the two leaders met and said, although it's just the beginning, President Trump said he trusts Kim Jong-un, although we'll have to see the evidence for his trust. I think that the fact that they were able to see eye to eye and also engage in in the statement it says a very in-depth conversations is very important. And that is a very important step that needs to be made in order to walk the path of denuclearization and to induce North Korea to that. So I think in that sense, although the nuclear threat is not gone by any means, it is an important first step, and we should not take it as an insignificant move.
Bill, do you agree?
Well, I think I would answer it a little differently. I think certainly the capability remains, not only the capability to employ nuclear weapons, but the undiscussed WMD, the chemical and biological, the intercontinental ballistic missiles can still be put on launch pads. Proliferation continues, particularly to the Middle East. North Korea, supports and perhaps helps engage in Syria's chemical warfare against its own citizens. None of this I'm aware of being raised at the meeting, which focused on just a small part of that. So as long as the capability remains, I think the threat remains, and not only here, but in the region.
Yeah. Jim, what do you think?
Well, I guess I agree and disagree a bit with Soojin. I think this was a beginning, but what was it the beginning of is the real question. And prior to the summit, my concern was that Kim Jong-un was not, in fact, willing to relinquish his nuclear program, and I was hoping to see out of the summit some concrete indications that he was serious. And so I didn't see any of those concrete indications. So therefore, I still remain skeptical that this is the beginning of a process leading to peace and reconciliation. I'm not saying it's impossible, but my skepticism has not been reduced as a result of the outcomes of the summit. And the second point I guess I would make is I don't think it's possible to induce North Korea to give up its program. North Korea has to decide if it wants to give up its program or not. If they make that decision, then I think it can be negotiated, verification and timelines and so forth. But if North Korea has not made that decision, there isn't any diplomat in the world who can induce them. So I really think the key in all this is Kim Jong-un and what his decision is.
Yuki, how about you?
North Korea's nuclear threat is gone in the sense that we are definitely not at the brink of second war on the Korean Peninsula. That said, though, I really don't think the threat itself is gone at all. I tend to agree with Jim that we really haven't seen any concrete indication from Kim Jong-un himself about denuclearizing North Korea. And there is an important distinction of denuclearization of the peninsula and denuclearization of North Korea. And I was hoping to see the clear indication of the latter, which I didn't see in the summit. So I would say North Korea's threat is still very much there. Although I do say that it wasn't an important beginning of the process that the two leaders have met. And because of our president's leadership style, I think this was the only way to get this process going. But when he said I trust him, and I trust Kim Jong-un, it reminded me of when President Bush met President Putin and later on said, I saw the guy in the eye and then I thought he was I was able to trust him. That kind of gave me a little bit of a reminder of that. So I'll just stop at that for now.
Finally, Troy.
So I'll just be brief. We have a long way to go. This could be the beginning of a process. It could be similar to the past to where it could fall apart at some point in the future, and we should keep that in mind. But the reality is, as has been said before, nothing has been irreversibly done, and we can get into debate what can or really be irreversible. But tomorrow North Korea could totally change course, and so we're at a beginning, but there's a long road ahead, and that requires a process of negotiating out a lot of the details and then actually implementing what we've agreed to, and that's going to take time.
So a lot of us here in the room were watching live as this unfolded in Singapore. I know here at KEI we were doing some live commentary and talking about some of the things as they were unfolding. I'm wondering for you, was there anything that stood out to you or that really surprised you in that moment or as this first meeting unfolded? Maybe let's set the statement aside for a moment, but the meeting itself, was there anything that surprised you? Bill, why don't I start with you?
I was surprised actually that more wasn't accomplished. Let me just put it that way. Not looking at the media coverage of the shaking of hands and the expression of warmth between the two. Truly, I was anticipating a much more substantive document, and I was rather surprised that something of that sort wasn't forthcoming.
Jim, what do you think?
I think the thing that surprised me the most was President Trump's comments in the press conference about US-ROK exercises. And the two aspects of that surprised me and frankly made me feel chagrined were first that it appears President Trump had discussions with Kim Jong-un about US-ROK alliance issues without talking to our alliance partner. Which sends a signal not only to Korea but to other alliance partners that these arrangements are on the table for negotiations. And the second part that, maybe three parts dismayed, the second part that dismayed me was the use of North Korean language. The exercises are provocative, which I don't think was helpful. And then the third thing that surprised me about this conversation was his comment that these exercises are expensive. And if you think about that, what that means is the US, or at least President Trump, is not committed to the alliance because he's looking at it in terms of expense. And maybe he's saying the United States can't afford to be an alliance partner because we can't afford these exercises anymore. And that sends a message not only to Korea but to other alliance partners. So I think those three aspects of that statement were quite damaging to our alliance relationships, and I was surprised that they were offered without having a sort of a more comprehensive approach toward the whole issue.
I'll ask you too, Soojin. I know that we've obviously seen 2 inter-Korean summits now, and as someone who formerly worked for the Korean government, was there anything that surprised you, perhaps in contrast to the inter-Korean summits, or anything that was similar that stood out to you?
Well, I actually wanted to pick up from what Jim said, is that was the part that really struck me as well, because I did not expect a very detailed statement to be produced at the end of the summit, because it is, after all, the first historic meeting, and you can get so much. You cannot get all the details of action for action or the nitty-gritty of what we would like to see. Of course, we would have to work on it for sure, starting today, I think, now that the big framework is set. So it didn't surprise me that the joint statement that came out of the summit was like kind of bare bones, a skeleton-like. But the fact that during the press conference, President Trump said the military drills, what he called war games, won't take place, that took me by surprise. And for the reasons that he mentioned, I won't go further on that issue. But I think President Trump maybe had dual goals of first trying to give maybe security assurances for North Korea as a sign of showing that, although it was not written in statement, that, I empathize with you, I understand you, as a kind of way to kind of move North Korea to take the measures that we want them to take. On the second hand, it was a sign to South Korean government that the burden sharing cost will definitely come up and have an advantage. It's for the South Korean government saying it's costly, so kind of an advantageous place in the future negotiations. But aside from that, what really surprised me was Chairman Kim Jong-un's remarks before the actual official summit began. To me, it sounded rather direct and frank about the kind of obstacles he had to overcome, and it kind of showed by saying that the past fettered the limbs of in English it was translated, but he said that it was not easy to get here. And also the fact that he said, although there were many obstacles, he overcame them, and he's there now. I think it was a kind of a statement saying that despite all the past, the wrongdoings or misunderstandings, he strove to get here. And it was a kind of statement in his own way, and a quite actually frank way, I think, of his will to go this path, given, it wasn't said, given that, this confidence building takes place. So that, I think, although we would, of course, I also am very critical of being waiting for actual substance to have confidence, but I think those little things are actually clues of what Kim Jong-un might be thinking, and I'll stop there.
Before the summit took place, did you have something, Troy? Go ahead.
Just 2 quick things I'd add. One, while they had put out the schedule beforehand, I was surprised that it wasn't a joint press conference, that it was Trump alone. And I think that actually says a lot, that Kim Jong-un didn't feel comfortable or did not want to be up there with President Trump. And I mean that because I think he knew that he'd get the hard questions if he was there, and so he didn't want to have to answer what basically we all wanted out of this, which is him to say the words, "We will denuclearize." And so I think, that surprised me. I think that's an important part that hasn't been touched on.
And he did do that for the inter-Korean summit, right?
Yeah, no, and that's why, if he hadn't done that at the inter-Korean, and so I think that is a significant contrast between the 2 summits. There was one other point, but it slipped my mind, so I'll just leave it at that then, maybe.
Sorry, I interrupted you and lost it. Yes, please.
Just add on to this, the reference to the US-RK joint military exercises, that we're not going to have this war games, quote unquote. What really bothered me about that, and that was the part that surprised me more than other, how skeletonish the joint statement was and all that. But I think the tone that he said it, that basically we don't need exercises because it's expensive. I think that really speaks a volume of no matter how much Secretary of Defense Mattis try to assure the allies, if this is the tone that's carried from the very top, I think this speaks a volume, and I think Japan certainly noticed it. And I would be very curious to find out what kind of a conversation that the Secretary of State Pompeo will be having in Seoul with his Japanese counterpart and the South Korean partner. Because already I think some of the rollback had begun by when Vice President Pence met with some of the Republican senators and got a pushback on that. And there's still like massive confusion about what President really said was, which is a traditional pattern. But for him to come out with something like that quite unilaterally without consulting South Korean government or Japanese government really kind of speaks a volume with the way that this president looks at alliances. It's really not about commitment. It's about cost. It's about trade-offs. It's about burden sharing.
And if I may add, while I focused on my major surprise, yes, I agree, that was a bit of a surprise. Particularly, it appears that, at least from some accounts I've read, that he didn't even consult with the Secretary of Defense before making this statement. Not to say that he didn't talk with South Korean and Japanese leaders. So militaries need to train. You know, if you ever were in the military, what did you do 90% of the time? You trained, right? And if you're serving overseas and you've got a defensive role, you've got to train. And training is not a war game. So I don't know if they're going to wordsmith this, walk it back. Senator Gardner's comments appear to substantiate that these kinds of exercises will continue. So again, I'm left in the dark as to where things might go from here.
Troy, a final thought, and then we'll.
Yeah, I guess on this part, I mean, I think we're all surprised by the announcement of the exercises, but my inclination, because President Trump made the comment in his remarks that we have to talk to South Korea about how much they pay, is that it wasn't just that it's about he sees it as a cost issue, but that he sees this as leverage in another negotiation. And I think that surprised me as well, and I think that's somewhat disconcerting. But the other thing I just want to say real quick is, if you look at where we are on denuclearization, if you contrast the statement here to the one in the September 2005 statement, this is a step back from that. So we're further behind, and maybe that's not surprising because we're at a different point. But the whole idea going forward was that the Inter-Korean Summit was supposed to set up the U.S. summit so that way we could get something on denuclearization. And what we got in this statement on denuclearization is in essence a reference to the already vague and supposedly set up statement in the earlier statement. So we haven't really advanced beyond even the Inter-Korean Summit in that sense.
So picking up on a couple of themes that you've already mentioned, number one, this being just the beginning, that we have a long ways to go, that the statement was vague or didn't have a lot of substance to it. So my question is, what would you like to see in the next few weeks or few months that can add a little bit more meat on those bones? Or what would you like to see in the sense of concrete steps that would make you feel more comfortable that we're moving towards a denuclearization or towards a bigger deal? And I'll start with Yuki.
I think what we're all more or less looking for is more of a concrete time schedule in terms of how the working level consultations begins. I really don't care where, frankly, but if it's going to be bilateral, is it going to be closer to U.S. North Korea, South Korea, or is it going to be more looks like it's four-party talks? Is it looking approximately like six-party talks, or is this primarily U.S. North Korea bilat, but U.S. continues to maintain close coordination with Japan and South Korea? And at what level does the negotiation start, and what are the benchmarks that we can see to learn whether talk is progressing or talk is stalling? And usually, if you see the level of the consultation going up the chain and a more senior, that is an indication that talk is really going well. But then if you stay at that level that it started, and then let's say 6 months from now, we're still there, then that is another indication that there's some major glitch in the negotiation. So I think those are some of the concrete measures, or I guess guidelines or benchmark indicated by either one of the government I think is more or less what we're looking for.
Jim, since you've worked in the State Department before, you might have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, I certainly agree with what Yuki said, but another thing in addition to the how we move forward with North Korea that I'd like to talk a little bit about is our relationships with our allies, because as was said, this is the beginning, but we're not sure what it's the beginning of. But no matter what the outcome of this process is, we would like to emerge with continuing strong alliance relationships. So we don't want to do things that undermine our alliance relationships. And right now, if I can just look at it from Japan's point of view, Japan really has 6 concerns about what's happening. And as an alliance partner, we need to be aware of those concerns and trying to figure out how to mitigate the concerns. And the number one concern Japan has is the credibility of the United States as an ally. And I think, Yuki mentioned this as well, I think going forward we want to avoid steps that further undermine our credibility and our sense of commitment to defending Japan from attack, because Japan is still a frontline state now. They're within range of North Korean medium-range missiles, and they have very legitimate security concerns, and we have undertaken an obligation to defend them. The second concern, obviously, is the whole question of, is this about denuclearization or is it an arms reduction talk? And in a sense, we're recognizing North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, sort of like India or Pakistan. That would be a major difference because the Japanese have always taken our assurance that we're about CVID, we're not about arms reduction. If there's going to be a shift in our goals, we need to consult with our allies first and take their concerns into account. Another Japanese issue are the North Korean delivery systems, and they were concerned that there was no mention of missiles. That doesn't mean there weren't talks about it, but I'm hoping we're talking closely with Japan and taking their concerns into account, because U.S. military bases in Japan are threatened by these medium-range missiles. We have an interest in this as well. The fourth concern is the degrading of economic sanctions. President Trump seems to think that he controls whether sanctions are lifted or not, but in fact, the process has already resulted in a degrading of sanctions, and so we need to think more seriously about what that means and how that affects our leverage. The fifth concern Japan has is its place at the table, or not having a place at the table. President Trump in his press conference mentioned, oh, well, Japan and Korea will pay for the costs of this. Well, that may be true, but they then should be at the table having this discussion. We don't decide how much they're going to pay. So I think it would be good for us to start talking about multilateralizing the process, since it's not only about nuclear weapons. And then the final concern Japan has is about abductees. And there, actually, I think President Trump is getting credit in Japan for having raised the issue. No one in Japan thinks he can resolve that. And now the ball has moved more to Prime Minister Abe's court. But I think on that issue, actually, the U.S. is getting some credit, at least, for the statements that we raised this issue with Kim Jong-un.
Yeah.
Actually, picking up on some of the remarks that Jim made is, I mean, and also Yuki made, is that I totally agree that we need more concrete steps to be spelled out and a more of a specific timeline, so to speak, a roadmap, so to speak, to follow, to abide by, for denuclearization to take place and for us to check, if we're on the path. But at the same time, although that is absolutely necessary, there are a number of things that I also want to mention is that for denuclearization to proceed, although there are so many other issues we do need to address, like the abductee issues and human rights issues, which is really, really, I mean, North Korea is, we all know, one of the worst places of human rights situation. So those are all, I mean, they are legitimate issues to be addressed, but we've just set off like this sail, and if we put all those issues, which are legitimate, but all at once, even at the beginning, I think it's very unlikely for the ship to float and make a good sail. I think we first have to make sure at the initial stage remain more or less very focused on the issue of at the top of the priority list, rather than put all the issues all at once. So I think that's one thing that we want to be mindful of. And also, I totally agree that for peace and stability to take place in Northeast Asia, we need a multilateral organization or cooperation, that's for sure, to ensure that North Korea and also other party players in the region remain and are cooperative. That is for sure. But again, if we expand it too quickly to a multilateral setting, I think there's a saying in Korean, if there are too many rowers on a boat, the boat goes to the mountain. So I think at the beginning, it's important to remain focused. And for now, this issue, whether we like it or not, has to begin with North Korea and the U.S. seeing eye to eye, more or less, and start off with a. So I think we need to take that into consideration.
Just quick, biggest.
Well,
Sorry, go ahead.
I actually sort of have a contrasting view, and I may be in the minority on the panel on this. I actually think, and now, denuclearization will probably move quicker than talks on other things, but that one, we need to put everything on the table that we want. One of the things that was in the statement was that, you want this new relationship between the United States and North Korea. And if we don't address the things that we need to address, and we don't talk about it up front, then you're not going to have that relationship. And I think this is one of the lessons from the Iran talks, which is that, we often talk about, well, what is politically feasible in the country that we're dealing with? And that's important. If we don't understand what's politically feasible in North Korea, we're not going to get a deal. But we also have to understand what's politically feasible in the United States. And if we get a deal on denuclearization, but it doesn't address, at least to some extent, all the other issues, that deal may not be sustainable here. So I think we need to take and make sure that these issues are on the table. And we also need to make sure that the North Koreans know we're going to talk about this. Because if we come back to them 6 months from now and say, now we want to talk about X, they're going to legitimately say, this was never about that.
Just quickly, I want to go back to something that Jim had mentioned, and I saw a lot of nodding, especially from Bill, on the fact that this has already loosened sanctions a little bit, or not the sanctions themselves, but loosened the enforcement, perhaps, or the follow through on sanctions. So, can you talk a little bit about, number one, do you think that's the case? Do you see already a loosening of hard-won sanctions? And then number two, if there is some progress, how would it work in terms of giving some sanctions relief in order to encourage the process to continue?
Before I get there, can I make a couple of other comments? First, on what Jim said, alliance management is really, really important in this context. In past, students of U.S. relations with Asia might recall that the U.S. has sometimes conferred with its allies ex post rather than ex ante. It has always created strains in the relationships. The State Department and the foreign ministries go to great lengths to paper over the evidence of these strains, but it's there if you care to look. And I think we could be in for a round of very difficult relations with our allies in the region if consultations aren't held in future in advance so everybody's on the same page and in agreement. Second, Jim mentioned the blurring of objectives. Where are we talking about denuclearization or some kind of dearmament? Reduction in arms and so forth. If it's simply a reduction in arms, you might as well tear up the NPT. And you'll see nuclear breakout states perhaps taking action fairly quickly to defend their own interests in the best ways they can. And I mean, who comes to mind quickly? Japan, Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, even Brazil, right? They all have the potential to do something very fast. And we've already got the exceptions of Pakistan and India. So one more exception, NPT, in my view, would be very, very difficult to resuscitate. So from there, sanctions. Yeah, I agree we saw evidence of relaxation of China's implementation of sanctions prior to the summit. Coal trade's picked up. We've got a lot of offshore oil transfers going on at sea. We've got North Korean restaurants operating again, which are forbidden as joint ventures or even as cooperatives. North Korean-Russian business continues without much check. And of course, we still see North Korea activities in the Near East and in Sub-Saharan Africa. So all of that is ongoing. And the fact that these talks have taken place probably is going to encourage sanctions evaders to continue with what they're doing because it's lucrative, right? And what are the chances of their being designated now? How strong are sanctions going to be enforced? I think it's going to become a much more difficult process to get judicial prosecution of sanctions violators in a lot of different countries around the world. In terms of the agreement, there seems to be a lot of expectation of business opportunities opening up. I would not hold my breath on that. It would take very specific exemptions for this to occur. Right now, you cannot invest in North Korea. You can't cooperate. You can't send money. It's pretty comprehensive in terms of what you cannot do. I know people in South Korea, or at least some folks, are dreaming about the reopening of Kaesong. That cannot happen under the terms that Kaesong originally operated under, because there was South Korean underwriting of the risk. So they adopt different terms, maybe something can be done, but you're not going to have a U.S. market. We're looking much more closely at supply chain analysis, and so I can see just a whole host of difficulties. Bridgeable, exceptions can be made, but I think those are going to have to depend upon progress in other areas.
Soojin, I have a question for you. If you can put yourself in the shoes of President Moon, how is he feeling today? How is he seeing the progress that they've made at this summit?
Wow. Well, I think from what the statement says out of Cheongwade, the Blue House, is that President Moon is very happy that the summit took place and described it as a historic summit that opened new chapters in history. Although there is also, amongst those Korea watchers and analysts, we were disappointed at the substance of the summit itself. But I think, as I said again, this is perceived as a beginning, and President Moon perhaps sees a bigger role for himself because the joint statement that came of the summit is very principle-oriented and without any details. So for this to move along and to produce results, and of course, North Korea and the U.S. would need to, and it said in the statement that they would expeditiously engage in negotiations. So that will take place. But what we've also observed is that the summit itself was on and off because of misunderstanding and the rhetoric involved. So it probably would be President Moon's role, kind of, to make sure that each side do not rub each other on the wrong way, or without intending to, or maybe out of ignorance, or etc. So I think he would be busy in his mind to prepare himself to maybe help the two sides move along. So yes.
And then, of course, we've talked a little bit about Japan, but Prime Minister Abe himself has come to Washington multiple times. He seemed to be very personally concerned about what was going to happen. So, Yuki, what do you think Prime Minister Abe is thinking today?
I think he's much less happy than President Moon, I would say. He's certainly, he and his advisor ought to be certainly concerned that there was no mentioning anywhere in the joint statement about the reference to the delivery system of the nuclear capability for the ballistic missiles, to be exact. And then also, I think Japan is very concerned about President Trump's reference to the suspension, at least, of the US-RK joint military exercises. And also, I think people within Japanese government are, start to get really concerned about the way that President Trump refers to the alliance. it was a lesser surprise, but then another surprise that I got from President Trump's press conference in Singapore was that he was there to talk about North Korea and how the summit goes, and he kept talking about trade deals with South Korea, and that ought to be concerning to Japan. And that exactly the same thing happened when Prime Minister Abe came to Washington last week in the press conference. The main focus of the discussion was North Korea, and yet President Trump kept raising these trade issues and how much military equipment Japan buys and how Japanese companies should now come and invest in the U.S. So I think this is a very different White House that the Japanese government, and I would argue probably South Korean government also, is used to respond to. Because whatever happens in the trade front, there was always a tacit understanding that we don't mix the two. Alliance commitments are solid, ironclad, but we can have these other issues that we disagree, agree to disagree, or even have a bitter disagreement on. But let's not touch this fundamental commitment of the alliance. And I think people in Japan are starting to see more and more signs that President Trump might see this fundamentally differently. And that's very concerning from Japanese perspective.
Could I just, I agree with what Yuki said, but if I could just supplement, I think everything Yuki said is true, but Japan right now has no choice except to support President Trump in his effort. And certainly the public statements from Prime Minister Abe have been supportive. He said, I'll do everything in my power to work through the bilateral framework with the United States and through the trilateral framework with the United States and Korea to resolve the pending issues. So he's publicly supportive. I think he sees what happens to people like Justin Trudeau when you publicly criticize President Trump, and that's not an option for Japan. But those positive statements don't mean that Japan isn't quite concerned. So I agree completely with what Yuki's saying. I think the one area, though, where the Trump administration has done a good job in alliance management is there's been very open channels of communication. Prime Minister Abe met with President Trump in person several times prior to the summit. They've had numerous phone calls. President Trump called from the airplane on his way home. So at least I think the leaders' communications, and then the Secretary Mattis and Secretary Pompeo have also done a good job. So at least in that area, that aspect of alliance management, of communication, is good. The challenge, I think, is the communication has mostly been after the fact, the U.S. telling Japan what it did, rather than consulting and taking Japanese viewpoint into account when it moves forward.
So we've talked a little bit about these international stakeholders, our allies, but there are some stakeholders here in the United States as well. Congress has made it very clear they want to be involved, and they're taking an active role. So Troy, what do you think the role of Congress will be now and if we get to a point where we're making some sort of deal?
Well, I mean, historically, one of Congress's roles is basically holding the administration to account. And what I mean by that is, if you look at prior sanctions on North Korea, it has not been the administration that has been going to Congress saying, please give us more authority. It's been Congress saying, we think you're not doing enough. We think you're not putting enough pressure on them. You need to do this. And I think we need to keep that in mind. But if we look at the process going forward, Secretary Pompeo has said that in contrast to the Iran deal, they want congressional buy-in. There's been discussion of a treaty, whether it be a peace treaty or some other kind of treaty. The treaty requires 2/3 of a vote in the Senate, so 67 votes. The question is how do we get there? And this was sort of my point about, we have to have something that's politically viable in the United States. If we come with a deal that doesn't have not just strong denuclearization provisions in it, but addresses the other issues. One of the things that we haven't talked about yet, Bill raised the chemical and biological, and so I think, that's one of the things that Congress will raise, especially because of Kim Jong-un last year and the Syria connections. But, we haven't talked about cyber. If there's not some kind of understanding that, let's be honest, there are certain cyber activities that every state engages in that are related to traditional espionage, and that's not going to change. But the outright theft of basically, finance from banks and cryptocurrency exchanges, the outright theft of intellectual property from other countries, WannaCry basically shutting down computers around the world for extortion. There has to be some kind of understanding that these behaviors will not be acceptable going forward. And so how do you get 67 votes in the U.S. Senate if North Korea hasn't agreed to stop stealing basically from everybody? They haven't agreed to give up chemical weapons. They haven't agreed to address other issues that may be, difficult in the relationship. And so I think, we saw today, after President Trump said, now we no longer have a nuclear threat, there was a parade of people on TV from Congress in his party and others, in the Democratic Party saying, well, we still have a long way to go. We need to see how the process works out. So, I mean, this is their role. One is to take and, making sure that the administration is doing the things it needs to do. Two is to take and basically ultimately take and approve any agreement that's met. So, I mean, this is why I said, we have to remember the politics in the U.S. as well.
So I asked you guys at the beginning if there's anything that surprised you, and one thing that surprised me was we did have this very bare bones statement, but the one thing that was specifically mentioned is the POW return of the remains.
Or MI
repatriation.
return.
Yeah, and MI. So, sorry, yes, I apologize. So what do you guys make of that? That was one of only 4 points in this statement, and do you think that that's a good concrete step that can build trust and move forward? Bill, maybe I'll start with you.
Yes, I think that was a good result of the summit. It's something that would help a lot of families bring closure to their missing loved ones. We've cooperated with the DPRK in past on recovering remains. My understanding of the relationship on the ground between the U.S. soldiers that are tasked with this and the DPRK soldiers that accompany them, they were able to maintain very professional and helpful relations. So I think that's a decent building block. One of the issues, of course, is how are we going to pay for the expenses? It probably is going to take President Trump to provide some kind of exemption, and you're going to have to find some way to get the money there. And I'm not sure that international banks are going to be willing participants in this, given all the different sanctions that are in force right now. So how this happens, direct payment of cash on pallets, something of that sort, that's been done in the past as Seoul. But, it's difficult to move beyond a remains recovery, I think, into these other areas where a lot of equities are at stake.
Bill, I would just add on the pallets, we'd have to get a UN exemption for that because you can't transfer bulk cash now either.
Absolutely, that's true. Thanks.
Yes, please.
I think, like you said, it was the only one specific with the details. I think it's very important and a positive one because denuclearization is so abstract and it takes such a long time. But this is something that can be done very rather quickly, and that can be visible. Especially not just to the experts, but to the people in the United States. And one of the things that I think the summit was able to achieve was, up until now, North Korea has been demonized. It was the devil, and there was no room for North Korea to get out of that shell, even if it wanted to, and even if it wanted to maybe change course. So I think in that regard, having those remains repatriated, it will show to the people, especially after the unfortunate death of Otto Warmbier last year, that although there's so much to be done about North Korea, it might be possible that it could change, even with these little, not that because it's insignificant, but those moves and gestures could be a beginning of a sign of a new North Korea. So,
Just quickly, I have a problem with the word demonized. I think North Korea's actions have justified its characterizations. I mean, he murdered or had his brother murdered in the airport of Kuala Lumpur. The state has conducted narco trafficking. It's counterfeited U.S. currency. It has taken U.S. citizens as hostages time and again, even violating the Chinese border to do so in the case of a pastor. So I think it lives up to its reputation, and I certainly wouldn't call that demonization. Yet I'm very much in favor of engagement and trying to work toward a better relationship between North Korea and the rest of the world. I'd love to see it become normal.
I think I need to clarify. I'm not saying that North Korea, the word with the demonize. I mean, there's numerous list of things that North Korea did wrong and was rightly criticized and should be. But what I'm saying is that although that's what it has done, and it recognized that Kim Jong-un recognized that at the beginning of the summit in his remarks. What I'm saying is that even so, for North Korea, what's important at this point, I think, I think Jim mentioned, is that although inducements should also be offered if North Korea does actually make tangible, visible progress on denuclearization, the most important fact, like Jim mentioned, is that North Korea itself should change its thinking that, this may not be the right path. This is not in our interests. So in order for North Korea to make that decision, it needs to feel more even if it does, nobody's going to trust us. Nobody's going to give us the room to make that change. I don't know if this is the right analogy, but for criminals, what they serve, they do their, in the prison. But for those few, maybe, who do want to change, who do want to have a better life, they need to be given, I think, the benefit of doubt so that they could, give it a try. So I'm saying that, I'm not saying that, it's North Korea does not deserve to be demonized, but this is a new beginning. So although we need to make up measures to ensure that North Korea does not repeat the bad behavior, we should still open up some space so that it can, if indeed, although we'll have to find out, if it indeed North Korea does change its thinking, give some room.
Yuki, you had one?
Yeah. On the MIA issue, I think it is definitely, the repatriation is something tangible, and it's an expression of the goodwill of the North Korea. But what's astounding to me throughout these processes is that these actions, little gestures that North Korea demonstrates, like return of the 3 hostages, the 3 American hostages, or this specific reference to the repatriation of the MIA remains, it really moves the needle on threat perception of North Korea. And so that actually worries me a little bit, that when North Korea starts showing this good faith effort on every other area, but not the critical one, in nuclear, then there might be an atmosphere beyond the government. They're saying North Korea they're trying hard. We should give them benefit of the doubt. And that creates an environment that makes it harder for the government to keep their eye on the ball, which is really the hard security threat, which is nuclear, chem bio, ballistic missile, their conventional capabilities, and there are human rights violations that are actively going on right now. So that's what concerns me a little bit.
So I'll have one final question before we open up to the audience. This one for all of you. The title of our program is A Turning Point for North Korea, and it has a question mark on the end. So do you think it's a turning point for North Korea? And I'll start with Troy and kind of go this way.
I think it could be. One of the things that I think we need to keep in mind, and in some ways I may be echoing something Soojin just said, is we're dealing with a different North Korean leader than we have in the past. He does things differently. That doesn't necessarily mean we'll get to where we want to go, but this is a different situation. So we need to be, I think, open to the possibility. But I also think that if we're going to find out if this is, sincere, we need to see Kim Jong-un do something that genuinely surprises us, and in a good way. I don't mean necessarily a bad way, because if you look at what's happened so far up to date, Just go back 6, 7 months, and we were in, I think we kind of call it the fire and fury phase. They had threatened to attack Guam. They had tested the missiles, and then they literally turned out a dime and said, we're going to the Olympics, and now we've started this process. So, the change in attitude perhaps isn't surprising because, one of the things that I've talked about before is I don't think they could have tested through the Olympics. I think they know that would have been basically one of the ends for them. So, they had to make the move. And Kim Jong-un himself has said, we've completed our program. So if you've completed your programs, you have to figure out what is our next policy, what is our next step going forward. And so all the timing, it kind of lined up. So the outreach isn't necessarily surprising. If you look at then what they've done in terms of, offering a summit, something they've wanted for a long time, taking and promising to freeze tests. Well, if you've finished your programs, you don't need to test anymore. So that's not really much of a shift. The tunnels, they collapsed. They haven't allowed inspections yet, and there's now suspicions that it may have been more cosmetic than anything. So this looks like what they did before on the cooling tower. I think it could be a turning point. I think we need to give Kim Jong-un maybe the benefit of the doubt on that. But I'd like him to do something that makes us go, we really didn't expect them to do that. This doesn't look like the past. There really could be a possibility here.
Yuki, what do you think?
I remain skeptical, and for one reason and one reason only. I really looked for Kim Jong-un to come out in his own words to say, we will denuclearize at the end of the summit, which I didn't hear. So all has been said is Kim Jong-un said this, Kim Jong-un said that by someone else. And I really was hoping to get that direct word from him himself at the joint press conference, preferably. But then it ended up being it was just President Trump who went up there for the podium. So we still have not yet heard him directly say, I commit my country to go through a denuclearization path. So until I hear that, I will remain skeptical.
Yeah, Jim.
I very much liked the question mark at the end of your title because essentially I don't think we know if this is a turning point or not. I would agree with Soojin, however. I'm also skeptical like Yuki, but I acknowledge there's a chance that perhaps this is a turning point, and it would be a shame if the United States didn't take advantage of that chance. So I think it's incumbent on us to do everything we can to sort of test out North Korea and see if this is a turning point or not. My only concern is we need to do so in a way that doesn't undermine our alliances and doesn't undermine our national security.
Bill, what do you think?
I agree that it's a question mark. We've seen potential turning points in the past. Red Cross talks 1972, that was supposed to have been a turning point. The North-South talks of 1992, that was supposed to be a turning point where they said, let's not have any nuclear weapons on the peninsula at all. The meeting with Prime Minister Tatsumi, that was supposed to be a turning point. North Korea's economic reform in the early 2000s was supposed to be a turning point, right? So maybe this time it is a turning point. I come from an intelligence analyst background. Intelligence analysts by nature are skeptics. You look for multiple confirmations. I don't have them yet, so I'm skeptical. But at the same time, I'm hopeful that something's going to take place this time, that North Korea will take advantage of the opportunities that's being offered. The rest of Asia, look at the difference, right? China's economic success has raised all boats in Asia except North Korea's. And I actually have a question I would like to pose, but after she has a chance to respond.
Soojin, last thought.
Well, I agree with all of you that it is still a question mark. There is no hard evidence. And I would like to see that hard evidence rise along the path, even albeit small, gradually. But what I think a little differently from maybe all of you is that although I do agree that it is still a question mark, I think it is our obligation to make it an exclamation mark by working together. Especially as a South Korean, we want to see denuclearize North Korea. And of course, that includes, eventually, with North Korea to agree, the term denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and peace to settle on the Korean Peninsula. And that means not just on the Korean Peninsula, but beyond, in the region. And for the world now, it's a global issue. So although it's still a question mark, I think it depends on our efforts, on our concerted efforts to make it a reality. So I think although we still have that question mark and skepticism, and rightly so, I don't think we should just sit back and say, oh, it's the same old play again. We should work on it if we want to change that question mark to an exclamation mark.
I believe you have a question before we turn over to the audience.
Yeah, I do. In the run-up to the summit, while we did have some consultations, but Kim also signaled his efforts at alliance management. He had meetings with Russian Foreign Minister. He had meetings with Xi Jinping. And my question actually is, he flew to the summit on a Chinese plane. Now, does that signal strength, or does that actually signal weakness?
Well, and not only that, but the photo on the cover of Dodong Shinmun had the Chinese flag featured prominently, so he wasn't even hiding the fact.
Right.
And it also had the Star Alliance symbol.
I think these are very important, although they may not seem so. Changes in the character, nature of this new leader. From what I understand from my past experience and work is that North Korea is all about face saving, and they don't want to be shamed. So they would never, even if they do in private conversations, they would never recognize such things like, they're poor or they had to borrow airplanes. But this time, this new leader is so different. It has it on the front page of the state newspaper, and it shows his inclination to be more practical than just a reputation. Of course, I mean that still is important, but the inclination seems to have changed, and I think we need to take advantage of that.
Yeah, I think this is one thing that is different about Kim Jong-un. If you think about it, they've, in the past, under his leadership, acknowledged missile failures before, something they wouldn't have done. In the summit with Moon Jae-in, he acknowledged that, there are parts of North Korea that aren't that great, specifically the roads. And so, I've been trying to look at these, the one thing that I come to think of is, he's the third generation leader. He also knows that even despite their efforts, that information about the rest of the world seeps in. So part of me wonders if he kind of realizes that he can't try to present an image of omnipotence because no one would believe that. And so that he has to have some degree of grounding in reality to be, the leader in North Korea. So I think, that's one of the interesting things. But, Soojin's right. I mean, as we go forward in this process, we need to be asking questions like, what does North Korea want? And I don't mean that necessarily in the sense that we usually do in terms of like a relationship with the United States or something. But when we think about how you make this work, if we don't ask the questions, what do they want, what do they need, and how do they want it? Meaning, we talk about the question, do they want assistance from the United States, or is that bad? Do they want to maintain a nuclear program or something? Well, we know that there's still this desire to have some type of independence. And so when we talk about the nuclear issue, should we be talking to them about saying, listen, obviously we have concerns about you having a nuclear program, but we also know you want independence. Should we be taking and investing in basically renewable energy, wind and solar and other things? And that's the kind of thing that you could also deploy quickly to like rural areas in North Korea that are underserved. So we need to be asking, I think, these types of broader questions. And he might be open to some of these things because, South Korea, and I think this is a good thing South Korea is doing, wants to take and work on reforestation. What are some of the things Kim Jong-un has done since he's been there? Well, he either had executed or eliminated, it's unclear, one of his prior forestry ministers because they didn't follow his orders on forestry. He's talked about reforestation. It's clear something he wants. He has the ski resort. I think there is, if you look at what he's doing, this desire to try and, maybe this is the right term, but beautify North Korea and everything. And so, we shouldn't just simply say, we offered you in 2005 everything you could ever want and assume that that's really what they wanted because we offered it then. So we need to ask these questions and try and see how we can get there. And, this is going to be hard, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
I definitely want to get to the audience questions. So I will go ahead and start here. If you can wait for the microphone, we have people in the back that are coming for you right now. If you have a question for a specific panelist, please indicate that, or if you want for the whole panel as well.
Thank you. My name is Mike Larkin. I'm with the Forum on International Affairs. And in light of the local elections that just took place in South Korea after the summit, I'm curious if we could get a description of the views across the South Korean political spectrum about President Trump's statements on the military exercises. Depending on where you fall in South Korean politics, how provocative or not provocative are the military exercises considered? Thank you.
Soojin,
I
you
can
might be the
start.
best for
Yes.
that.
Well, I think we still have to get the results of the local elections to be confirmed to give you a definitive answer. But regarding how provocative the issue of military drills is that it is very provocative. It is very important, especially for the conservatives in Korea who do have a big sway. Although we still have to find out what President Trump meant by halting the war games, I don't want to go ahead of what really is meant. But this issue is, first of all, an alliance issue between U.S. and the ROK to decide. And had this been just unilaterally decided and announced without any consultation with the South Korean government, this would serve as a good criticism for the conservatives that the South Korean government, President Moon, failed to keep a good alliance and was not even informed or consulted regarding such a major issue. So that would maybe undermine President Moon's status or place within the domestic politics. But I think we still have yet to find out what it really means and how things will go from there.
Does anyone else have thoughts or? No, next question. Okay. Yeah, sir. Right there.
Hi. I must congratulate you because most of you in the audience are, I would say, cheerleaders to vilify and demonize North Korea. So your title is A Turning Point with North Korea. It should have been a turning point of US-North Korea relationship. Because if you vilify North Korea and say they've done these bad things, the United States has done similar ample bad things throughout the world, including against North Korea. So given that, if Mr. Trump has decided to meet him, it's really a turning point in the United States too. And if the United States can do business with China and Russia, doing business with North Korea would be much easier if the United States gets its bias and kind of demonizing activities that it always engages in, whoever it focuses on and decides to demonize. Given that, and there was a question that Mr. Trump saying that the war games may not be needed, and he said it's costly, but I think it is a definite provocation. And when United States and South Korea does these provocation and North Korean leader hits back with his provocation, there is a continuing military confrontation. So if a relationship has to be changed, there has to be give on both sides. Just as US-China relationship, people said China is changing. It's not just that changing. United States is changing.
Yeah, so if I can ask this in that way, do you see the exercises as provocative, and if not, why?
I don't see it provocative. Bill said it perfectly. I mean, military needs to train. Just like it's a routine thing for them to do. And I think I have to point out that these exercises are not games like President seemed to have made it out to be. They serve very important purpose of maintaining the readiness of the force, which is going to be essential whether it's on the Korean Peninsula contingency or not, and then I would highlight that part or not. U.S. military, if they are operating in that part of the region, they need to be able to effectively operate together, shoulder to shoulder with their allies. And for that types of military exercise serves very important purpose. And it's not a matter of cost. It is a demonstration of our defense commitment, alliance commitment, and also it goes beyond North Korea. That it is a demonstration of United States messaging to its strategic competitors that U.S. is willing to stand up for its allies for certain principles and in defending certain acts which they considered aggressive and disruptive. But given that, I think what I'm more concerned about is the way that it was announced. So had there been enough consultation pre-announcement with South Korea government and with Japanese government about what he means when he announces these things, I think we would see much less upset leaders and officials in East Asia. But the initial response that came out of Tokyo and Seoul really kind of suggests to me that there were very little of that. And that's I think, what's more concerning, especially when, like Soojin pointed out, that Kim Jong-un coordinated very closely with his allies. So he's coming in from a position of very well coordinated his actions with his allies and friends, whereas U.S. is coming in from a position of disrupting the G7, and now, basically leaving our two important allies in the North Asia kind of out in the cold, almost.
If I can add to what Yuki already said, is that the drills are defensive in nature. The militaries, the joint militaries, are doing these exercises to prepare ourselves in case of military action. So they are defensive in nature, and they're not intended to be provocative. But to kind of understand from North Korea's perspective, although it is defensive in nature and intended not to be provocative, from North Korea's perspective, it has constantly been saying it is provocative, and it's threatening. It's very scary. So to take that into account, I think especially when we have U.S. nuclear tactical weapons deployed, that's when they really get scared. And that may have actually changed North Korea's, helped North Korea's mind coming to the summit, part of the factor. So I think the military drills need to be conducted on a regular basis until this whole situation comes to a closure with a peace treaty. So that's a given. But what I think could have been considered is the deployment of U.S. nuclear tactical weapons. Because had this, if North Korea makes progress on denuclearization and the talks are going on smoothly, then as a kind of a reassurance that the deployment of nuclear tactics could have been considered to reassure and also encourage making further tangible progress, but not at this point.
Yeah.
Quickly, and then we'll take another question.
All right. First, reacting to these by North Korea's reaction to these as provocative is part of their playbook. You have to realize how North Korea's economy is organized. And you have to realize the large portion of the economy that's represented by what's called the Second Economic Committee, which handles all of its defense industries and so forth. You have to recognize that North Korea's got 1.1 million under arms, about 1/5 of the working age population. And you have to recognize that if you've operated in a war economy from about 1963 to date, you need to have an enemy. You need to be able to mobilize the country. And so anytime you can create this kind of atmosphere, it works in your favor as demonstrating why we have to continue to have such sacrifices being made by the civil population. And finally, again, on this demonization of North Korea, I would recommend reading the Committee of Inquiry report, which charges North Korea, I think, quite accurately with crimes against humanity. And while no nation has clean skirts, North Korea certainly has very muddy ones.
Yes, in the back.
Thank you. Yeonho Kim, recently joined KEI as non-resident fellow. I have a quick question about the issue of recovery of American soldiers in North Korea, which Bill and Troy briefly mentioned. I think the difference this time is the issue has been discussed and agreed upon by the two leaders. So probably this time the project could be dealt with in a very different way. So probably Kim Jong-un, if he is willing, he would want to make this happen without having to get any financial compensation from the U.S. as they did before. And President Trump would be very much interested in having this happen also. So if in that case, I wonder if we still have technical issues, including UN sanctions against North Korea. And if my assumption is correct, what would be the impact on the dynamics between the two countries moving forward and the way American people view what's going on now? Thank you.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll say something, then Bill, you can jump in. But in the past, during periods when North Korea and the U.S. have been negotiating, there have been periods where there's been a very positive program of cooperation for North Korea and American teams to work together to identify and repatriate remains. I think there's been over 200 missing in action remains that have come back to the United States, and each one has been meaningful to the family of that soldier. So in the past, there's been periods of cooperation, and I'm sure for the time being, there will be periods of cooperation, so that's a good step. But I wouldn't read so much into this. This has been done before, and it was turned off when negotiations on other issues hit roadblocks. So I agree, it's a positive step, but I wouldn't read too much into that because this is something that's been done before.
Yeah, I fully agree with just what Jim said. And I think if there, you have certain expenses associated with sending the teams and conducting recovery missions. I don't think there are any problems in covering expenses that can't be dealt with through sanctions exemption.
Yes, right here.
Thank you. My name is Monica Montgomery. I'm coming from the Arms Control Association. The question that I have for you guys today is if you could speak whether you think it's important that the U.S. going forward includes our allies or regional powers, even including Russia and China, more in the negotiations, whether you think more larger party talks would lead to the success of the negotiations for denuclearization, or you think that maybe this time a more bilateral approach would prove to be a more positive path to success. Thank you.
Very good question.
Shall I start
Yeah,
then?
go ahead.
I think it's critical to begin including other players. And President Trump himself hinted at this in the press conference when he talked about Korea and Japan paying for things. So if they're going to pay for things, they need to be part of the conversation. But also, if this really is a turning point and North Korea really is serious about reducing its military threat to the region in exchange for economic inducements, there's going to be a lot of need for international organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, Asian Development Bank, and others to become involved. And those are multilateral organizations that have members, not only Korea, Japan, and the United States, but European friends and others. So yes, I think it's critical at some point, but I don't think this is an either-or situation. I think there's things the United States needs to talk about with North Korea. There's things that South Korea needs to talk about with North Korea. So I wouldn't call this an either or, but involving allies and friends and supporters, I think is very important.
Maybe I can just add quickly. We haven't talked much about Russia. We've talked a little bit about China. But I mean, both of these countries have legitimate interests on what happens on the Korean Peninsula. And if we want to try and avoid an increasing degradation of sanctions, and if we want to take and maybe prevent people from going off some sort of off script and doing things, we need to bring the Russians and the Chinese in some way, so that way they feel their interests are being protected and that their interests are being addressed. And I mean, so even we've said this about our allies, but it's true of Russia and China as well. Or otherwise, the Chinese will just say, all right, this is done, as we're sort of seeing them hint, and just stop enforcing things. Or the Russians will start using Rason more and trying to cut more deals with the North Koreans.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intel analyst and a former diplomat. I note that the reason they used a Chinese airplane is because they simply had no long-haul transportation aircraft to do the job, so they borrowed one. I also note that digging a test tunnel is about 3 or 4 weeks. So that is a gift, worthless, absolutely worthless gift. And my bigger concern is answer to Troy's question, which is, what does North Korea want? It wants one thing and one thing only: job security for the regime. That's it. So we are going to, about a year and a half from now, bump into a verification wall, because there is zero chance, I didn't say a small chance, there is zero chance that they're going to allow unrestricted IAEA or OPCW inspectors to run around North Korea. It's not going to happen. And he has every motive to move part of his nuclear infrastructure into the prison camps or into one of those 700 tunnels that lie all over the country. So there it is. Verification is off the table. Tell me what Plan B is. And I've asked this question of 100 experts. Not one of them has had the guts to tell me what Plan B is and why we are leaving job security for a guy who kills a couple hundred people in his prison camps every single month.
What do we do when he says no to inspectors, or these certain things that he's done so far prove to be not irreversible as we would like?
Well, I think we'll likely go back to where we were 6 months ago, the brink of war. And I think President Trump has no qualms to go back should he find that North Korea is not sincere about taking even baby steps and ultimately the necessary steps toward denuclearization. So I think North Korea, Kim Jong-un knows that. I think he's aware of this situation, and although we'll have to wait and see what kind of measures North Korea, Kim Jong-un agrees to, I don't think we should say there is zero chance. And I think to increase that chance, one of the things that needs to be fostered is, although we do not agree with Kim Jong-un's dictatorship, we have not been able to make it collapse. And many of the people have been waiting for North Korea to collapse.
When did we try?
When did we try to collapse them?
Oh, I'm not saying we tried to.
Oh, we saved it.
But many waited, and given the circumstances, they said it was likely that North Korea would collapse, even in South Korean government, just even until the previous government. But it did not happen. It's not easy to make it collapse. So I think it's in our responsibility to make its strategic shift, which it announced in its in the April plenary session of the Workers' Party. Now that it's stated that its focus is reconstructing its economy from nuclear development, we need to make it implement what it is stated, and to make it implement those. Its new strategic shift is in our hands, I think, to foster that.
I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. We'll start here. I'll take both of them here and then in the back.
Yes, Dave Fitzgerald, retired Foreign Service. A brief question about what would be the next step for President Moon. It seems there seems to be a need, given some of the vagueness coming out of this summit, to clarify or attempt to get more clarification on denuclearization. Is there a possible second summit or third summit, if you want to call it, to really get South Korea now more engaged with North Korea and being simply the go-between or the caddy for President Trump and Chairman Kim?
And then in the back.
My name is Grace Kong. I'm with ICAS. So in considering all the comments that were made today, for which party is time more likely to run out? North Korea, it seems that China has North Korea's back so long as it doesn't overly act out. So maximum pressure is unlikely. On the other hand, it seems that deterrence and containment has worked in preventing North Korea from using its WMD against South Korea and Japan. So isn't it also unlikely that it would ever launch anything at the US? So the US is not in really that urgent of a situation either. So in your opinion, which party more urgently needs a deal, or in fact do neither, and is it likely to just go back to what it has been?
Yeah, so these two final questions, and if you had any final thoughts as well, please do add those on and we'll wrap up.
Well, President Trump has basically a 2-year timeline because there's no certainty of re-election. So we have the shortest timeline. Kim Jong-un has as long as his natural life progresses. So I think in that sense, you have, and that's why you see a lot of this talk about wanting to conclude things before President Trump's first term is done. That being said, there's an advantage to that, which is that if we don't want this process to drag out, and if we don't want to basically go down the same path before, we do need to have a sort of strict timeline to motivate people. Now, the caveat to that is depending on which nuclear science expert you believe, this could take 36 months to upwards of 15 years. So it's likely not to all be done under President Trump's first term. But I think that deadline is probably a key factor going forward.
I would agree. I think baseline for some form of verification needs to be established while President Trump is during this president's first term, not too close to the primary season, actually. So I think we probably are looking at next, at most 12, 18 months, I would say. And then otherwise, beyond that, you will have a U.S. leader who's distracted about either his reelection or making sure that whoever he designates as his successor will get elected. But this always has been the challenge that U.S. side, and I will also say that about Japanese side and South Korean side, that our leaders' life cycle on this is much shorter than certainly Kim Jong-un's, but then also his allies. So Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Putin. So that is going to be the very difficult first step, whether we can establish some kind of concrete verification steps set up in the next 12 to 18 months or so.
Getting back to the first question about President Moon's next steps, I do want to give a lot of credit to President Moon and his efforts over the past, since wintertime to try and move things forward. And I think the thing he's done much better than predecessors in South Korea who've tried this is really continuing to work closely with the United States, even as he was pursuing an engagement policy with North Korea. So obviously that role will be critical going forward. But if I were giving President Moon some advice, and he may already agree with this, it's also to branch out and remain in very close touch with other parties who are important China, Russia, Japan, and so forth. So I think President Moon has a very critical role to play moving forward in kind of helping this, keeping this process moving forward. In terms of the question of time running out, I mean, you were looking at it from a U.S. domestic political point of view, but stepping back from that and just looking at U.S. interests, I actually am a believer in the containment and deterrence strategy. I think it will continue to work. So I'm not of the school that the world comes to an end in 6 months unless we achieve denuclearization. I think in that sense, the U.S. has time. But what we need to do then is pursue this possible opening with North Korea while not undermining our deterrence and containment strategy. And so one of the things we really do need to be talking about very quickly with North Korea is non-proliferation issues, because that would change the dynamic very quickly if it turned out North Korea was selling its technology to rogue states or other actors. So I do think, and I agree with Troy's comment, we can't only focus on denuclearization of the peninsula. There's other urgent issues we need to talk about. But I think we can, as a nation, afford to be patient, and it may well be a future president that signs the final agreement on denuclearization, but I don't see that as a
Yeah, and I was viewing it specifically from the leadership perspective.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to say that, when nothing gets done in 12 or 18 months, the world is going to come collapse. I'm just saying that I was just making a point that if we couldn't get something concrete, fairly early stage on the table, we will lose this momentum of the potential opening.
Yeah, and to be honest, if we don't have something in 12 to 18 months, this probably isn't real anyways.
Yeah, that's true.
Bill or Soojin, any final thoughts?
Agree with all the above. I think that President Trump has shown he's not a very patient man. And so while the U.S. may have the shorter timeline, it imposes an even shorter timeline on North Korea to respond actively to the invitation that's been made to it. Whether they do or not, I think we'll get some indications in terms of the output of the various working group meetings that are yet to be scheduled, but probably will be. And I'd like to underscore what Jim said about proliferation. I'm not worried about North Korean missiles flying with nuclear warheads to the U.S., at least not right now. I am very worried about North Korea selling WMD and its technology to non-state actors. They've done so in the past. They proliferated. Syria, Libya, they're a known proliferator.
Soojin?
Yeah, I agree with what Bill said about the timeline, and also with the other panelists, that unlike, North Korea, unlike other democracies, does not have a timeline. But at the same time, like Bill pointed out, for Kim Jong-un, he needs to seize this opportunity with the president of United States, President Trump, at the moment. So he does have some kind of a timeline he needs to work on. And in addition to that, while we may not want to recognize, and we tend to kind of disregard the need for Kim Jong-un to meet the needs of its people, because he's a dictator and an autocrat, there is still a big need for him to address the people of North Korea. And given the circumstances that North Korea has been marketized so much, and so many people rely on these markets, Kim Jong-un does not have much time to show, to deliver to its people that he is capable of feeding its people because of the sanctions. And while there are growing concerns, and legitimately that the sanctions are losing its steam, still, the sanctions are intact, and unless UN lifts those sanctions, there's so much that China or its allies could provide. And from what it seems, Kim Jong-un is not interested in barely just not starving its people. It wants to make dramatic developments in its economy. So, and he has promised that to its people. So although it's not a democracy like us, and he won't be voted on it, he still needs to demonstrate to a certain degree that he is capable of bringing about development in economy now after the nuclear development. So he's also on a certain timeline to demonstrate.
All right, well, I really want to thank you all for coming. It's been a really great discussion on, obviously, an evolving issue, so we'll have to keep having these discussions. Please join me in thanking the panelists.